Receri Domine maritum bisoni, vitalis nitidis qualinque soni, se humiles favori modulis venerando fini, se juveas tragitam variis liberare mari.
Hi, this is Stan Brakhage, babbling along here at KAIR, making another tape for broadcasting, and one part of my mind talking to the other and shaping the meat tongue with air and sending it onto a tape and out over the airwaves eventually. And a lot of people understand something, and some people don't understand anything, and nobody understands everything, and even I don't understand all of it. But if I were to start babbling, as we say, and go ba-da-ba-da-boo-da-ba, ba-da-boo-ba-ba-ba, like that, and went on too long, it would become very disturbing. And yet we're used to it in ancient music. We've heard it all along. For instance, these beautiful old Basque folk songs, the songs of the Auvergne. First one I'm going to play you says, in articulate French, quote, "Unfortunate is he who has a wife, unfortunate is he who doesn't have one. He who hasn't one wants one. He who has one doesn't want one." And that's so altogether obvious, I mean, that's an end quote there. That's so altogether obvious that then there's nothing left to do but break into sounds that don't really mean anything except this is what we've all heard and all know, and that doesn't even necessarily make it true, or some such babbling. Here it is. And so it goes. The second refrain on that, by the way, to be fair to the ladies, is, quote, "Fortunate is the woman who has the man she needs, but even more fortunate is she who hasn't." and then it goes into the same babbling sounds. So we're used to that, and yet in modern times, there's a kind of turn that's been taken, sharper, harder, and not yet accepted by most people. But I hope you'll listen to this sound poem, a poem made up using noises and actual, in this case, the ABCs of the alphabet, both in English and in Greek, as well as other languages at times, to make a kind of music very close to baby talk, in a way, to the roots of all our talking. So this one is done by the collage artist and painter Kurt Svitters and is read by his son. And this is the end of a long sound poem, the final movement, we might call it.
Glim, glim, bim, bim, grim, 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 glim, glim, bim, bim, O, B, O, B, O, B, O, B. Z, Y, X, V, V, U, T, S, R, Q, P, O, N, M, L, K, H, G, F, E, D, C, B. Z, Y, X, V, V, U, T, S, R, Q, P, O, N, M, L, K, H, G, F, E, D, C, B. Z, Y, X, V, V, U, T, S, R, Q, P, O, N, M, L, K, H, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. Z, Y, X, V, V, U, T, S, R, Q, P, O, N, M, L, K, H, G, F, E, D, C, B.
And so we have the end of what's actually, oh my goodness, it must be a 40-minute long piece of music, I would call it, but not of a kind that most people are used to in modern times listening to. Gertrude Stein, in the same spirit and in the same town as Kurt Svitters, involved herself with these origins of language all her life, and was ridiculed and laughed at. Why, I wonder, don't we ridicule and laugh at children? But then, of course, we do. And yet, there's a spirit that reaches out to them. I used to sit and talk with the babies, and I think almost every loving parent does, making these sounds. These sounds out of which, this large repertory of sounds that any baby can make, out of which that child will carve a very limited set of sounds that will then be the language that he or she has learned. Numbers also stand in a strange relationship to this development, and Gertrude Stein, along with the composer Virgil Thompson, made several operas, the most famous of which is Four Saints in 3 acts. And the scene that I'm going to play you is actually all about making a scene. And it's all about the possible numbers of this scene. And a scene, of course, for saints could be a break in the meditation spirit and or a sin. So the language even puns on that. But basically, it's just a nonsense of number.
with them and a measure.
It is easy to measure a settlement.
Scene 9.
To be asked how much of it is finished. To be asked, Saint Teresa, to be asked how much of it is finished. To be asked, Saint Teresa, to be asked, Saint Teresa, to be asked, Saint Teresa, how much of it is finished.
Saint Teresa, how much of it is finished?
How much of it is finished? Ask how much of it is finished.
Ask how much of it is finished.
Ask how much of it is finished.
Saint Teresa, Saint Paul, Saint Plan, Saint Anne, Saint Cecilia, Saint Plan.
Once in a while.
Scene 11.
And so it goes on, and of course is mixed with just enough tantalizing, understandable English language that people, in fact, enjoy it. But there's no reason why it couldn't entirely be made up of numbers, as some works of hers, Gertrude Stein's that is, are. Really, what we're talking about, the need to break into, well, first of all, language to begin with, and then maybe you might say secondarily, that world of number which is somewhere between language and, 3, abstract thinking, or what's called the inexpressible. Well, artists are always going to stray into the realm of the inexpressible because really that's their work, is to try to push through those boundaries, the same as astronauts do through space. Those boundaries of the known kinds of thinking and communicating in the mind. But then also there's ways to do that in daily living, which I think William Faulkner, to name one, is the master of writing about. I mean, there's James Joyce expressing, in Paris also, where lived Swiders and Gertrude Stein, there's James Joyce creating a way to express what was called interior monologue, the mind just rambling on with words and language. But William Faulkner, who was said to be writing under the influence of Joyce, has actually, in his novel, The Sound and the Fury, taken on the task of expressing the idiot mind. Idiot, of course, if you know your Greek, is a word that merely means a private person. But an idiot would be someone who would be babbling, and in his thinking, as the character Ben in The Sound and the Fury, he would be considered to be babbling. And then, of course, the book by William Faulkner also deals with other characters, an outside description. And by the end of it, I come to the sense that Faulkner has really taken on Shakespeare's dicta about life, that it's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, and created a something that makes it possible for me to really feel that the idiot's mind, in its so-called babbling, and anyone else's can all mix and make a marvelous weave. Well, anyway, in the section that I've chosen to play for you, they are all going to church. That is Dilsey and the idiot Ben. And the narration is outside the incident, and so the experience is being described. But just listen to what happens when the congregation all gathered together to hear their favorite preacher give the same old sermon in the way they love, encounter a strange minister who's been brought in from St. Louis and who doesn't at first impress them at all, and then note how finally he does.
And when they saw the man who had preceded their minister enter the pulpit still ahead of him, an indescribable sound went up, a sigh, a sound of astonishment and disappointment. The visitor was undersized in a shabby alpaca coat. He had a weazened black face like a small aged monkey. And all the while that the choir sang again, and while the 6 children rose and sang in thin, frightened, tuneless whispers, they watched the insignificant-looking man sitting dwarfed and countrified by the minister's imposing book with something like consternation. They were still looking at him with consternation and unbelief when the minister rose and introduced him in rich, rolling tones whose very unction served to increase the visitor's insignificance. "And they brung that all the way from St. Louis," Phroney whispered. "I've knowed the Lord to use curiousitudes and that," Dilter said. "Hush now," she said to Ben. "They fixin' to sing again in a minute." When the visitor rose to speak, he sounded like a white man. His voice was level and cold. It sounded too big to have come from him, and they listened at first through curiosity, as they would have to a monkey talking. They began to watch him as they would a man on a tightrope. They even forgot his insignificant appearance in the virtuosity with which he ran and pawed and swooped upon the cold, inflectionless wah of his voice. So that at last, when with a sort of swooping glide he came to rest again beside the reading desk, with one arm resting upon it at shoulder height, and his monkey body as reft of all motion as a mummy or an emptied vessel, the congregation sighed as if it had waked from a collective dream and moved a little in its seat. Behind the pulpit, the choir fanned steadily. Dilsey whispered, "Hush now, they're fixing to sing in a minute." Then a voice said, "Brethren." The preacher had not moved. His arm lay yet across the desk, and he still held that pose while the voice died in sonorous echoes between the walls. It was as different as day and dark from his former tone, with a sad, timbrous quality like an alto horn, sinking into their hearts and speaking there again when it had ceased in fading and cumulative echoes. "Brethren and sistren," it said again. The preacher removed his arm, and he began to walk back and forth before the desk, his hands clasped behind him. A meager figure, hunched over upon itself like that one of long immured and striving with the implacable earth. I got the recollection and the blood of the Lamb. He tramped steadily back and forth beneath the twisted paper and the Christmas bell, hunched, his hands clasped behind him. He was like a worn small rock whelmed by the successive waves of his voice. With his body he seemed to feed the voice that, succubus-like, had fleshed its teeth in him. And the congregation seemed to watch with its own eyes while the voice consumed him until he was nothing and they were nothing. And there was not even a voice, but instead their hearts were speaking to one another in chanting measures beyond the need for words. So that when he came to rest against the reading desk, his monkey face lifted and his whole attitude that of a serene, tortured crucifix that transcended its shabbiness and insignificance and made it of no moment, a long, moaning expulsion of breath rose from them, and a woman's single soprano, "Yes, Jesus." As the scudding day passed overhead, the dingy windows glowed and faded in ghostly retrograde. A car passed along the road outside, laboring in the sand, died away. Dilsey sat bolt upright, her hand on Ben's knee. 2 tears slid down her fallen cheek, in and out of the myriad coruscations of immolation and abnegation and time. "Brethren," the minister said in a harsh whisper, without moving. "Yes, Jesus," the woman's voice said, hushed yet. "Brethren and sistren," his voice rang again, with the horns. He removed his arm and stood erect and raised his hand. "I got the recollection and the blood of the Lamb." They did not mark just when his intonation, his pronunciation became Negroid. They just sat swaying a little in their seats as the voice took them into itself. "When the long, cold, oh, I tell you, brethren, when the long, cold, I sees the light and I sees the word, poor sinner. They passed away in Egypt, the swinging chariots. The generations passed away. Was a rich man? Why he now, oh, brethren? Was a poor man? Why he now, oh, sister? Oh, I tell you, if you ain't got the milk and the dew of the old salvation when the long, cold years rolled away. Yes, Jesus. I tell you, brethren, and I tell you, sister, there'll come a time. Poor sinner saying, 'Let me lay down with the Lord, let me lay down my load.' Then what Jesus want to say, oh, brethren, oh, sister, is you got the recollection and the blood of the Lamb, in case I ain't going to load down heaven." He fumbled in his coat and took out a handkerchief and mopped his face. A low, concerted sound arose from the congregation. The woman's voice said, "Yes, Jesus, Jesus. Brethren, look at them little children sitting there. Jesus was like that once. He mammy suffered the glory and the pang. Sometime maybe she helped him at the nightfall, whilst the angels singing him to sleep. Maybe she look out the door and see the Roman police passing." He tramped back and forth, mopping his face. "Listen, brethren, I sees the day. May is sitting in the door with Jesus in her lap, the little Jesus, like them children there, the little Jesus. I hear the angels singing the peaceful songs and glory. I sees the closing eyes, sees May jump up, sees the soldier face. We gwine to kill, we gwine to kill, we gwine to kill your little Jesus. I hears the weeping and the lamentation of the poor mammy without the salvation and the word of God. Yes, Jesus, little Jesus." And another voice rising, "I sees, oh Jesus, oh I sees." And still another, without words, like bubbles rising in water. "I sees it, brethren, I sees it, sees the blasting, blinding sight. I sees Calvary with the sacred trees, sees the thief and the murderer and the least of these. I hears the boasting and the bragging. If you be Jesus, lift up your tree and walk. I hears the wailing of women and the evening lamentations. I hears the weeping and the crying and the turned away face of God. They done killed Jesus. They done killed my son. Jesus, I sees, oh Jesus. Oh blind sinner, brethren, I tell you, sister, I says to you, when the Lord did turn his mighty face, say ain't gwine overload heaven, I can see the withered God shut his door. I sees the whelming flood roll between. I sees the darkness and the death everlasting upon the generations. Then, lo, brethren, yes, brethren, what I see, O sinner, I sees the resurrection and the light, sees the meek Jesus saying, they killed me, that ye shall live again. I died, that them what sees and believes shall never die. Brethren, oh brethren, I sees the doom crack, and hears the golden horn shouting down the glory, and the arisen dead what got the blood and the recollection of the Lamb. In the midst of the voices and the hands, Ben sat, wrapped in his sweet blue gaze. Dilsa sat bolt upright beside, crying rigidly and quietly in the annealment and the blood of the remembered Lamb. As they walked through the bright noon up the sandy road with the dispersing congregation, talking easily again group to group, she continued to weep, unmindful of the talk. "He sure a preacher, man. He didn't look like much at first, but hush. He see the power and the glory. Yes, sir, he seed it. Face to face, he seed it." Dilsa made no sound. Her face did not quiver as the tears took their sunken and devious courses, walking with her head up, making no effort to drive them away even. "Why don't you quit that, mammy?" Frona said. "With all these people looking, we'd be passing white folks soon." "I've seen the first and the last," Dilsa said. "Never you mind me." "First and the last what?" Frona said. "Never you mind," Dilsa said. "I see the beginning, and now I sees the ending."
And that was William Faulkner himself reading this passage from The Sound and the Fury in a beautiful, incantatory voice. And I'm moved to put on something that I recorded on a Sony Walkman riding in a bus through the snow, so that the sounds of passing electric lines and other force fields sometimes interfere, making their own babble and sometimes seem to dance with it, but I think what it is will overcome any difficulty of the recording. And of all things, it's Marilyn Horne singing to a live audience at La Scala. This music arranged by the American composer Aaron Copland, and I just can't describe to you what it was like to hear this and pick it up in this bus and to carry it with me and send it along to you.
Going by the
Thank you.